Welcome to the Des Plaines History Center. My name's Philip Moore. I am the curator here. And today we're just going to do a general survey of Des Plaines history. I think that the rain may have kept a few people away, but also this is extremely similar to the presentation I gave a month ago at our annual meeting. And the presentation today will also be available for groups to book through the History Center for presentation either here or offsite at a different facility. So if you think, hey, my church group or my senior group or my kids group or my school group or something would be interested in having an hour-long presentation about Des Plaines history, go ahead and give us a call or an email. And we can also just kind of tailor a few slides here and there to the history of your group or organization or business. So we can work with you on that. Pretty soon we'll have our new program flyer out in a few weeks. I just want to highlight a few things that are coming up. On the front table, we already have our afternoon adventure schedule. This is our weekly program for children. It takes place here during the summer. They're pretty cheap, they're very fun and educational. So if you know some young people between the ages of 5 and 12, go ahead and take one of these or take a stack and pass them out to hoodlums in your neighborhood or whatever. Coming up next month, our coffee talk on July 14th will be on Chicago river bridges. We have somebody coming out to do that. And our book discussion is A People's Art History of the United States, which is a retelling of American history through the lens of protest art. So we'll be talking about different ways to look at history through media. And those are available on the third floor of the library, but the discussion happens here. And then up here on the board, you'll see two things. One is the On the Street Community Photo Project in conjunction with the architecture exhibit and the architecture programs we have this year. We're inviting you to submit photos of houses, landscapes, buildings, businesses in Des Plaines that you find particularly inspirational or meaningful, along with a story so that we can document the Des Plaines architecture as it is now or as it was in the past. And then those will be part of a traveling mural that the Des Plaines Art Council is putting together, and they'll also be up on DesPlainesMemory.org, which is a website that the History Center does in conjunction with the public library. And Stephen in back there is our contact for that. So if you have any questions about Des Plaines Memory, talk to the guy in the tie. And then the thing on the right there is my plug for next year's exhibit, so our 2017 exhibit, which will be titled My Muse Des Plaines, and it's our experiment in community curation, we're calling it. And what that means is people are signing up. I have a sign-up sheet right here on my clipboard. People will sign up to do research and help me write everything for next year's exhibit. So you'll basically just be given a section of the wall. You'll do research along with me. We'll find some stuff in the archives and some objects out of the collections to go along with your idea. And we'll just see how it goes. We're just going to try and treat this exhibit like a Bob Ross painting. There's no mistakes, just happy little accidents, and hopefully everyone feels good in the end. All right. So I'm not going to go into my degrees because I have too many to list. We'll just go into the presentation. So my presentation is You Will Like Des Plaines. The artwork here is based on sheet music cover that I'll talk about a bit later on, but it's also the inspiration for our new backdrop, which today is behind the refreshment table. But we're also going to be doing a lot with this You Will Like Des Plaines seal here at the History Center because we think it's particularly inspirational for several reasons that will be apparent in the presentation. So we're going to start earlier than 1800, but really pick up analyzing history from 1800 to the recent past. I'm supposed to turn out the lights. Sue, can you go over and flip the bottom switch? Maybe you can see this a bit better. All right. So we're going to start back when the French coureurs de bois were running around Canada and the Midwest, exploring the land. The French words, and I'm not very good at pronouncing French. I took Spanish in high school. Translates to forest runner. You probably heard them called fur traders, fur trappers, that sort of thing. Harbingers of imperialism, whatever tradition you come from. And some of you may be familiar with what they look like based on the hard-hitting documentary series, The Red Green Show. And I think this is a pretty accurate representation of what they may have looked like. But it's important to think about the French history here in Des Plaines, because that's where we get the name Des Plaines for the river and for the town. And a lot of people walk in and they say, why is Des Plaines called Des Plaines, and why do you pronounce it that way? So we'll go into the history of that very briefly, and documentation about this is kind of sketchy, but this is the best that we've been able to do. It comes from the French word that they applied to the American sycamore tree. They thought it looked very similar to the plane tree of Europe, so they called the American sycamore tree Le Plaine. And out of that, because the headwaters of the Des Plaines River have a lot of these trees, and a lot of these trees grow along the banks of the Des Plaines River, it made sense to call the river Des Plaines, meaning out of these trees, out of the plane trees. All right? So that's where it comes from originally. And then English-speaking people like me do not know how to pronounce French very well. And so when you look at Desplaines, you think, oh, Des Plaines. So what we have is a corruption of the French words, Le Plaine or Des Plaines, pronouncing it Des Plaines. Other forms that we've turned up in various documents are Eau Plaine, E-A-U, meaning full of water, or actually that means water of the plains, or something along those lines, or Eau Pleine, meaning full of water, Eau Plaine, meaning out of the plains, and then down at the bottom is one of my favorites, Des Plaines with Z's, which is one of the buttons that's available from our gift store, which is right next to you here in the History Center. And along with the You Will Like Des Plaines theme, we have a brand new button now available. So, all right, so let's go back in time and talk about the native peoples who were here along with the French explorers before the United States formed. So we often talk about the Potawatomi tribe presence here in our area. So let's talk about the Potawatomi briefly. Around 1600, they were in what's now Michigan's Lower Peninsula, and their word for themselves was Anishinaabe, meaning in their Potawatomi language, meaning the people. The word Potawatomi is actually an Ojibwa word, so a related tribe's word for keepers of the fire. And that was because they were in council together, they had an alliance, they share a common ancestry, and the Potawatomi's job at the council was to tend the fire, which was a very honored post amongst this council, and so that's where we get the word Potawatomi. So here in this oval is where the Potawatomi would have lived before contact with Europeans. And what happened was, what got them into this area, I'll just throw a few things. It's important to note that native peoples always live in regular polygons on our maps. So they live in these perfect shapes. So to the east were the Iroquois Confederacy. In the middle were various Algonquian people, so the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, and various other related tribes and groups. And then to the west were the Siouans. And what happened was, in the mid-1600s to late 1600s, there were these things called the Beaver Wars, which was basically a proxy war between England and France that they had native peoples fight for them. And that wound up just kind of squishing all of the tribes a little bit westward. So the Iroquois expanded their land westward, which pushed the Algonquian people westward, which pushed the Siouan people westward, but they were also colliding and mixing and learning from each other, which is significant because when the Potawatomi lived over here in the Michigan Peninsula, they were largely a hunter-gatherer society. When they moved westward and they settled from along the west Michigan coast as well as sticking around Michigan and then coming down here into what's now Indiana. When they moved westward, these people over here in what's now Wisconsin learned agriculture from the Ho-Chunk people, the Winnebago people over there. And so we see this shift in culture as these tribes bump into each other. All right, then we get to the Battle of Fort Dearborn, which takes us right over 100 years. And the Potawatomi participation in Fort Dearborn was, okay, so in the War of 1812, many natives were on the British side because they did not particularly like that the United States was expanding westward. The British promised them to be able to keep a bit of their own land, less expansive policies in the British Empire, which is interesting. So what happened was on August 14th, 1812, the Potawatomi chief Black Partridge warned the U.S. post at Fort Dearborn that young men of the tribe were going to attack. And this is a theme that we see is the young people are not happy with the way that the older people are dealing with the white settlers. And so the young people go ahead and attack, whereas the tribal leaders are generally trying to work out something that ends in less bloodshed. So as the fort is being evacuated, the Potawatomi people attack and massacre the retreating military personnel as well as civilians who are also part of the installment at Fort Dearborn. And this is a representation of, there's Fort Dearborn in the back, and there's the Kinsey Mansion, if any of you are familiar with that scene. But where I'm going with this is not long after the United States was victorious in the War of 1812, they were again looking to remove Native Americans from this area and make it safe for white people to settle. And so you get several treaties ceding this bit of land, that bit of land from Potawatomis and other nations. Many Potawatomis allied with Black Hawk, who was a Sauk warrior, not a Potawatomi, but they allied with him in his 1832 Black Hawk War. And again, these Potawatomis who allied with him were usually the rough and tumble young men who wanted to fight for their land, and they were rebelling against the tribal elders who were saying, well, let's do something less bloody. And what you get from the Potawatomi who were living here in the Illinois area was that after the Black Hawk War failed to resist white settlement, was they voluntarily, meaning without having to be forced off the land, absolutely at gunpoint, they moved westward to the area where Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska intersect, that area. This was not the Potawatomi Trail of Death in 1838. This was earlier than that. The Trail of Death was mainly Potawatomi who lived in what's now Indiana. Okay, so once the Potawatomi were relocated, this area was officially open for U.S. settlement, and what we get are a lot of farmers coming through into Maine Township, and this is where we get the date that's on our city logo here, 1835. So there was no sense of place. There was not a place called Des Plaines in 1835. Nobody thought they're going to Des Plaines in 1835. There was no town here. There was not even a railroad here. This is when white people started settling. And they were squatters, by the way, because the township hadn't even been surveyed. So here's the survey map of Maine Township. Federal government sent people out to survey the land, and they made these charts. Township is 6 miles across, 6 miles tall. And Maine Township, not quite so, because if you ever try to put squares onto a sphere, they don't work. And so a lot of townships wind up being irregular shapes. So the township was surveyed in 1841, which means that the squatters could officially buy their land from the government, and then a lot of other people started filling in the land as well. So if you look here, there's already some areas marked enclosure because people had already built fences. All right, so who's coming in here? Yankees and Germans. And I use the word Yankee in the traditional sense in that it's people from New England. So we have a lot of farmers from Vermont, New Hampshire, that area, moving into this region of the country to have more open land to farm and to expand the United States. And we see that largely in the records of these people here. We have charts showing who were the first people buying land, and you get names like Thacker, Rand, Conant, Lee, Jefferson, Higgins, all very Anglo names moving here from New England. And you may also recognize these names from our streets, because you name streets after the people whose land they were built on, or near, or to. But then soon after these people settled in our area, you had an influx of German immigration, and you see the shift in names that were on the businesses and on the land deeds. So you have people like Hanfeld and Scheringhausen and Lagerhausen and those sorts of names. A lot of these things you'll recognize from historic documents, but not so much in the naming of the streets, because they came a bit later. And on the right here is my favorite document in our archives, so I put it on everything. It's a land advertisement with a map showing housing lots, but then it's in English here on the left, and it's in German here on the right. And I don't speak German. I speak less German than French. So it's difficult to read some documents from the time, but this shows you how prevalent German speech was here in the Midwest at the time. And in fact, you have cities and towns that have greater than 60% native German speakers. It's very common in the Midwest for that. All right, so what facilitated a lot of this movement was the railroad. And the first railroad came through Des Plaines in 1854, the Chicago, St. Paul, and Fond du Lac. Where it crossed the river, and by the way, this is now the UP Northwest, still runs right through the center of our town. Where it crossed the river, right over here, they built a sawmill, and they crossed the river at that point because it's a traditional fording spot in the river, so a place where it's shallow enough for people to cross. And if you look at older maps, you can see that there are trails that kind of all converge on that spot. So this is the logical place to cross the river, or at least the traditional place to cross the river. Where they built the sawmill, right here by the river, they built it there because by the river there's timberland. And so they could cut down the trees, they could make railroad ties, they could make buildings, all sorts of things for the railroad by building their sawmill there. And then this railroad went bankrupt in 1859, not very long after they started operation through, and it was purchased by the brand new Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which a lot of you recognize from the recent past. They ran this line out here until I think the 70s. Don't quote me on that. But they built the depot roughly where the current depot is, right here in the heart of Des Plaines. And that formed the epicenter of Des Plaines forming as a place. Because where the railroad crossed the river, the Des Plaines River, they put that sawmill, they put that depot, and they named that depot Des Plaines after the river, not after anything else that was around here on the landscape. Socrates Rand Road. He was a large owner of large tracts of land around here. He created the first subdivision. So he created the first town, essentially, here at the Des Plaines Depot. And it was called the town of Rand initially, and apparently he did not like having the town named after him. So when Des Plaines was incorporated in 1869, they incorporated it as the town of Des Plaines, and he was apparently relieved. But why are people moving to a place like Des Plaines, way out in the middle of nowhere, basically? There was farm or undeveloped land around here. And so we have to think, well, what are the push factors? Why are people wanting to move out of Chicago? So one is filth, because we have new industry coming in with no regulations on pollution and that sort of thing. There's no sewers yet. Chicago sewers don't come around until 1900. No housing standards, lots of crowding. And animal feces. It's not something that we like to think about, but when you have horse-driven transportation systems, and you're also the slaughterhouse of the world, there's a lot of animal droppings around. And so it's very important, if you can't move out of Chicago, it's very important to have a good pair of boots. You also have, in 1871, right in the middle of when Des Plaines is starting to build up, you have the Great Chicago Fire, which is a big push factor. It scares a lot of people out of the crowded conditions of the city, and if they could afford it, into the railroad suburbs. And then the suburbs also acted as a new ideal of how to live. So it was escaping the crowded conditions of the city, and maybe you couldn't have a vast estate in the country with this large Palladian mansion sort of thing, but you could have this lot of land all to yourself and your family, and you could have a house that you don't share with another family on that lot of land, and maybe if you're lucky enough you can have a row of trees in between, and you can sit on your porch and pretend like there's no one else around you. So it was an affordable way to have a bit of an estate. So you see a lot of middle-class people and a lot of people with this new ideal moving out into a place like Des Plaines. And here we have that same advertisement, and I blew up the map on it. So our railroad runs right through here. This is the river coming down the middle. And here's Old Town of Rand. So this area that we're actually sitting in right here at the History Center, this is part of the Old Town of Rand. And then we start getting these various other subdivisions added on, extending outward further and further from the depot. And one thing I like to point out is this area right here is labeled the heart of Des Plaines, right there. So this is north of where Metropolitan Square is today. And it seems like people expected this to be the center of town and for Des Plaines to extend upward and outward and downward with this as the center, when in reality Des Plaines expanded southward along the river and then westward. And there's a few things that drove that. First off, across the river's a very good natural boundary, and you're not going to expand your city across the river without a lot of effort. But also because south of Des Plaines, there were other communities developed that were later annexed into Des Plaines. So that's why we see expansion. But expansion northward didn't happen very well, and so we don't see, on today's map of Des Plaines, we don't see Des Plaines going north from here very much. One thing that came about around this time was the Methodist Campground just across the river from us. So they started camping in 1860, and in 1865 they started building permanent structures on their current site where the campground is today. So in 1860 they were using tents and things like that. 1865 they started building cabins and tabernacles and that sort of thing that you see in the landscape now. And what the campground is a miniature of the suburbs as they were in the late 1800s. And so you get all of these little cottages and you get all of these little roads. And the roads are plank sidewalks, but they're labeled with street names. So this is Ashbury Avenue. It says right there, this is Ashbury Avenue, between that all of these cottages are built on. And so if you lived in the city and you were a devout Methodist and you wanted to have a summer escape from the city for physical, mental, spiritual rejuvenation, this was your option. You could have a cottage, or your congregation could have a cottage out here and have revivals and retreats and that sort of thing. So that's why that exists. And they even built their own little platform and depot along the Chicago Northwest Railroad. That doesn't exist anymore, but we have a postcard colored in that shows that. All right, so I mentioned Town of Des Plaines incorporated in 1869. That demonstrates that we had a critical mass of people living here to actually want to form a government that controls things, that paves roads, that helps out with utilities and crime, that sort of thing. And then they were reincorporated as a village in 1873. So each reincorporation, they're taking a step up in the powers and duties of the government. This is our first village hall. This was built in 1892. This is the southeast corner of Lee and Ellenwood. So there's a mattress store there now. That's where this is. And you can see this photo was taken around 1907. So by 1907, they not only had the village hall, a devoted hall for government, but they also had running water, and they also had street light or stoplights controlling traffic. All right. Going back in time, let's talk about the history of the police department. So 1876, we had the first constabulary. So between 1876 and 1899, we had on and off constables. Sometimes it was constable for a day, sometimes it was a month. it really depended on the needs of the village at the time. And so it was time to time. And in fact, some constables, if you called them, you had to pay for their service, or sometimes the village would be paying them a salary for the day or just a stipend for the week or something like that. 1877, somewhere they built a lockup. So not quite a jail, but something with a lock on it for the ruffians, or probably the vagrants, that sort of thing, jumping on the train. And then in 1892, that first village hall, they included a jail in it. And here they are standing in front of the village hall steps. These are the city trustees. And then this guy right here on the end in the vest, that is A.W. Eckert, who was no, that's wrong. That is John Hanson, who is the first paid policeman here in Des Plaines, permanent job in 1899. So that's who that is. All right, fire department. So around the same time, we get the fire department forming, and in fact, right behind me is our 125th anniversary of the fire department exhibit. So this will be up through September. If you're interested in looking through later on, feel free to. In 1874, we had the first voluntary fire company. And that was not a government entity. That was a private company that the city paid to take care of fires in town. And the city was paying for the equipment and the horses to draw the equipment, that sort of thing. The men who were fighting the fires were unpaid. In 1891, the date that we're celebrating in the exhibit here, was the formation of the actual volunteer fire department, which was the government entity that transformed into what we have today. 1930, we got our first paid firefighter, and then by 1970, the entire fire department was professionalized, so there were no volunteer firemen at that time. And an interesting little note, the volunteer fire company, the first marshal of that was Benjamin Kinder, who built the house next door and owned the hardware store. And one of the last volunteer firefighters in the 60s was David Kinder, his grandson, I believe. So that family has been involved in a lot of our civics, but especially in the fire department. And this photograph is the first volunteer fire department crew in 1892, right after they had built the village hall. So the village hall included stables. These are the stable doors. And I'm told that the horses, when the alarm would go off, the horses were trained to leave their stalls and to stand where they are to be harnessed in front of the equipment. All right, so further to the south, around the same time, developed two communities. The first is Riverview, and here is a map of lots you could buy in Riverview. This top part here, right there, that's called Jefferson Avenue. On the map here, that's now Oakton, down south of us. So Oakton, south a bit, that's to orient you. And then the east over here is River Road, just off the map. And Riverview was developed as a industrial suburb. And what that meant was you have all of the modern conveniences of having a railroad through your town, and you also have the modern industry. So right over here we have Columbia Steel Car Works, which was going to be the economic heartbeat of Riverview, as well as other factories that would be fed by all of these railroad spurs and sidetracks and sorts of things. And So you could have this industrial employment, which was the modern thing to do, but you could also have this suburban living, which was our new ideal, to have a house out in the country, or a house that kind of resembled being out in the country. So the best of both worlds here. And you also have Columbia Park, or Central Park, right here. So we have these planned communities with healthy surroundings and modern work. And then, and here we go. Here's their depot, and just a few buildings built there in Riverview. And to the south of them, Orchard Place. And to orient you here is Higgins Road, and then the tollway now slashes right through the middle there. Just to the east here, this is where Mannheim Lee, it comes out on Higgins, all right? Or to the west. And so Orchard Place and Riverview have a bit of a different history. Orchard Place was not intended to be an industrial suburb. It was intended to be a rural suburb, and so you only have farming community around here, and then suburbs here right around the historic core. And so Orchard Place never built up as much as Riverview or Des Plaines did. And Orchard Place, interestingly, lends its name to Orchard Field, which has now become O'Hare. And if you fly out of O'Hare, you see that it's abbreviated ORD, that's short for Orchard. And this is where the Douglas Aircraft Factory was during World War II, and the reason O'Hare is as big as it is and where it is today. All right, so what was the kind of industry that was going on in Des Plaines and Riverview? And I've chosen Benjamin Electric to be our example. Benjamin Electric was located just northwest of downtown Des Plaines, right where, just east of where Cumberland Circle is now, along Seegers Road. There's a little creek that runs. So Northwest Highway would be over here, and Seegers would be over here. And they had the rail yard that pulls right into their land. And what they were doing there was enameling things, mostly. It started out as Royal Enameling in 1908. Benjamin Electric developed in Chicago and bought out Royal in 1913. And the reason they did that was Benjamin Electric was known for making light fixtures. Very, very nice light fixtures. And they put reflectors on the back of each one to direct the light. And they were making those out of steel. And they didn't have they couldn't manufacture a lot of stainless steel, and they weren't galvanizing their steel. And so what does steel do? It rusts. And so the cheap, easy, the best way to do it at that time was to enamel it. So that just puts a layer of glass on top of that steel, keeps it from rusting. And so Benjamin bought out Royal Enameling to vertically integrate their company. They could make the light fixtures, they could enamel it themselves. And eventually Benjamin moved all of its operations out of Chicago, its factory operations and headquarters out of Chicago into Des Plaines to this facility, and really built it up. So here's some pictures from the interior to show you what working was like in the early 20th century in Royal Enameling. Here we see men, and their faces are, and their clothes are covered with all kinds of chemicals and dust and dirt from the enameling process here. And you can see the conditions are not very pretty. And this is what women were doing in the factories in the early 20th century. They're doing the finishing work. So they're sanding off rough edges, they're finishing up some paint jobs, that sort of thing. So this is what a lot of young women would have done before marriage, is work in factories, or they could work in factories if they fell on hard times as well. Later, this is after World War II, what the factories look like. So gone are the giant vats full of enameling chemicals. We have all of this mechanized equipment here, conveyors moving these large enameled objects through. And then women running machines here. And you can see this woman is even wearing trousers. So we can see the social change and the change in workforce between the 1810s and the 1840s and 50s in Benjamin Electric here. Benjamin was bought out in the 60s and moved out of state and then was dissolved. Just tie a bow on that one. All right, what else was going on? Perhaps you all have been keeping up with the talk about our tagline here in Des Plaines. I've been asked a few times, well, wasn't Des Plaines called the City of Roses at one time, and was that official, that sort of thing. So let's look at the City of Roses, why we were called the City of Roses. In the early 20th century, the first half, Des Plaines was known as the City of Roses, or the City of Roses and Carnations, or any combination of flowers really, because of the large number of greenhouses we had in our landscape that grew roses, carnations, all kinds of flowers, and those were shipped via our wonderful railroad system to the Chicago market and all over the United States. So just to give you a clue as to how many flowers were produced here, in 1951, here's our sort of official tabulation from newspaper reports. Premier Rose Garden, our biggest greenhouse here in town, 10 million roses per year. Pesci's, 800,000 carnations per year. Benson shipped out thousands of orchids every day, and Amling's 1.1 million carnations per year. And these are only the big ones. There were several other companies that weren't as big, shipping all kinds of flowers as well. And the photo here on the right, this is Premier Rose Garden down at, I believe, Tui in Mannheim. And so you can see these are acres and acres of greenhouses, these lines here. And then if you can see these little lines that stick up there next to these small buildings, those are smokestacks for coal-fired boilers so that they could raise flowers year-round in these greenhouses. And just about all of this is gone from our landscape. In the last 70 years, they have just about disappeared. Here's the interior of one of the premier rose garden greenhouses. And where you have a lot of greenhouses, you need people to build and maintain the greenhouses. So there were a few companies that sprung up here and around just for that. Here's a picture of Winandy and Sons, and they are greenhouse builders, and this is their cart right around the turn of the 20th century, so they got in on the ground floor of this sort of thing. All right, so into the 20th century, we start seeing a lot of things that developed into what we know today, and the first is our Des Plaines Public Library. And our first public library here in Des Plaines was paid for in part by a Carnegie grant. So Andrew Carnegie, our steel magnate of the world, in his later years decided he had built up so much wealth it was time to give something back to society. And he was the champion of what we now call philanthrocapitalism, where you amass wealth and you return it to society. And so he set up funds to give communities libraries. And they didn't pay for it all themselves. You had to match 1-to-1 the grant money, and you also had to demonstrate that you'd have the framework to sustain the library after the initial grant. And so the Des Plaines Women's Club tried once, and they didn't get the grant, and they tried a second time, and in 1907 they raised enough funds and they had enough backing that they could convince the people in charge of the Carnegie grants that that the library would be sustained. So in 1907, we get our first public library. This is the building. It was at Minor in Graceland. And this was replaced later on because this is actually a fairly small building. And as the population of Des Plaines grew and the need for more and more resources from the library grew, they expanded into larger and larger buildings. But that's our first one there. And then right around the same time, a bit later in 1919, we got our park district. And it went for popular vote. And in 1919, 75 yes, 6 no. So overwhelmingly adopted by the Des Plaines population. And really what they started off doing was just taking care of some land that the village had already kind of set aside for recreation. And that includes the bandstand. I'll show you that in a second. The Earl Field, which is right across Prairie from us, where Central School is now. And then the high school grounds, which is now Central Park, where the original Main Township High School was. So there is the bandstand, and this was located just north of where our City Hall is these days. And so that was almost the extent of our public parks at the time. And that takes us into the namesake of the presentation and my favorite tagline for the city, "You will like Des Plaines." And this shows a transition from who was advertising and boosting Des Plaines to outsiders. Previously, the maps that advertised Des Plaines and Riverview and Orchard Place, those places, those were the land speculators trying to make the money off the subdivisions who boosted moving to Des Plaines. Here we have the Businessmen's Association, the Lions Club, those sorts of people boosting Des Plaines. So this is the cover art, and there's our little logo there. And this is what's on our back wall now. This is actually the cover of sheet music for the song Des Plaines. And on the inside, the left side, we have all the reasons you will like Des Plaines listed out. And it has some fun things over there. You know, they brag about the train, the library, 16 professional men, the Lions Club. But then on the right here, we have our little hymn of Des Plaines. And it was a poem by a man named Robert Risser. He had the slogan idea, the lyrics by Jack Eaton of the Des Plaines State Building and Loan Association, adopted to music by Miss Des Plaines herself, Savina Abe, and published by the Lions Club. So we have a lot of people going in on this. It's not just one person trying to sell a bunch of land for money. They're really trying to sell Des Plaines as a community and as an economic center. So for those who can't see, and that's probably all of you, I've searched all over far and wide, and now I found Des Plaines. The streets are paved, conditions best since I found Des Plaines. Growing town, never can be beat, up to date and full of pep, you will like Des Plaines. And I'm working on getting a recording of this from the Oakton Community College Choir, so maybe we'll be able to play that. It's set to a hymn, so we'll see what it sounds like. But this is the sort of thing that people were doing in the early 20th century to promote town. And Des Plaines really is growing at the time. Before World War II, there's never more than around 10,000 people in town here, but considering that nobody was permanently settled here in 1835, 100 years later, or 90 years later, we are incorporated as a city, and then 90 years after that, we have 60,000 people basically living here. And as the city grows, there's a larger demand, a larger duty on government services, and that's reflected in the physical plan to the buildings of the city. So in 1925, Des Plaines becomes a city. It also annexes the village of Riverview to our south, so we see the city expanding southward. And this is our new city hall. So this is a Georgian-style building. This was just west of our current city hall. And this has physical space for city offices. The police department was up here. The fire department is here. And the library is in the west wing over here. And later on, the library would move to the previous building down on Graceland and Thacker, and the police department would move into the west wing. So we see the building repurposed as the government continues to expand. During the Depression, the way that really hit Des Plaines was it halted suburban expansion in the area. And I want to highlight two areas. One is southeast of Thacker and Wolf, the Villas, the oval-shaped neighborhood that a lot of people can get lost in. And then the Cumberland subdivision, which is just north of Cumberland Circle. And these are two neighborhoods where you're driving through them and you might see stark difference between a couple houses that are sitting next to each other. Some houses are in this old world Tudor style brick and stone, timbering up top, that sort of thing. And then next to them are these flat ranch houses. And that's because they were built in decades that were separated by decades. These two subdivisions were started in the 1920s, late 1920s. 1929 stock market crash, 1930s depression. And so nobody was building new houses way out in the suburbs at this time. They didn't have the capital stability to be able to do that. And they also didn't want to invest in cars for transportation to get all the way out here, because we're even starting to get far away from our train depots. And then after World War II is when they start filling in the subdivisions with the ranch-style houses. So if you're ever driving through and you wonder, why is that? That's why. Here's a picture of the villas, partially built. You can see they put in all of the streets. They even put in the trees. They had all of the utilities roughed in. They were just waiting for people to buy these. And then the Depression happened. So this is facing east, and here's the villas, not quite half built, and the Westfield subdivision, not quite half built either. And you can see we're still surrounded by farmland here in Des Plaines, so we're way out in the sticks. All right, so I mentioned World War II. During World War II, even though there were around 10,000 people in our town, we had hundreds of men served. If you saw our exhibit last year, we had the honor roll of the men who served in World War II, and I didn't even bother counting how many hundreds were on there. And then we also had some women who served. On the left here, this is Louise Huck, if anyone remembers Huck's store here in town. She's part of that family, and she was a Marine. She served in Quartermaster at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. And then here in the middle, these are 6 brothers from Des Plaines, Jim Radlin and 5 of his brothers who served at the same time in World War II. And down here on the bottom, that's their mother, Bertha's. That is her 6-star service pin, which is quite an accomplishment. They also had a brother who served just before the war started, so there were 7 of them who were involved in the war, the preparation for the war. But this on the right here, this is from the Benjamin Electric newsletter, and this shows you how Des Plaines and the industry here was reacting to the war. So 3 more boys leave for service, and this is talking about we're adding them to our list of Benjamin Electric employees who are off on the war, and they're, of course, going to get their job back when they come back. But a lot of these articles also said, okay, so we had 3 more leave for service. Can we have 3 more ladies step up out of the community and run our machines? So that's what was going on during World War II. A lot of places were going about business as usual because farms still needed to operate to produce rations for the civilians and the military population. And places like Benjamin, they made those light fixtures. Army needs light fixtures, right? They also produced horns that were used on naval vessels, and we also had the Douglas Aircraft Factory down at Orchard Place. And so a lot of Des Plaines people were involved at all levels of the war effort. So here is the Douglas Aircraft Factory as it was during World War II. And then Des Plaines boomed. After the war, between the war and 1960, our population increased 5-fold, or 5 times. And we get a further increased role of government, and that's reflected in our physical plant for the government, which is the building we have now. This was constructed in 1977, so this entire section is for government bureaucracy. This section is for police department, and they don't even put the fire department here because it has 3 of its own buildings scattered throughout the community. So as the population grows, the need for government services grows. And then we get into the redevelopment of downtown. Everyone groans when I put that up. So tract by tract, farmland disappeared from our landscape, filled in by ranch houses. So we have basically no farmland by the end of the 20th century and no farmland by now in 2016. And so we have different ideas of what makes the core of a downtown and a thriving community. And this is the Herbert Barrel Parking Plaza, built in the mid-70s as part of the redevelopment of downtown. This is why we don't have our historic town of Rand right there, along with the Des Plaines Mall and the First National Bank tower. So this was the modern idea of how to make a thriving economy, take stores from the outside, put them inside, and then you don't have to worry about what the outside looks like because you just drive past them and you don't think about it. Here is the Des Plaines Park District administrative offices, and you can see that tower in back there. They were basically across the street from us here on Pearson. So you can see we're not just a couple people taking care of Bandstand anymore. We have an office. We have dozens of parks here in Des Plaines. We see St. Mary's building up. A lot of you remember the converted bowling alley directly across the street over here. They've gone through 4 buildings. So we're changing our landscape in the 70s, and then we replace the mistake of the Barrel Parking Plaza with our current library right here at the turn of the millennia, and this is how we've wound up with what we have now. So the library needs more and more and more space to provide the services expected of a library for a city this large, and so we wound up with this actually fantastic library right in the core of our town, and I believe this is a better core to our city than a parking plaza. And also, at this very same time, we have the condos coming into downtown. So we see this transition in our housing in the historic center of Des Plaines. And this is our first condo complex, approved in 1969. It's called the Hamlet. And it's a kind of a suburban take on a contained community in a way. You don't have stores and restaurants in it, but maybe for Des Plaines this is like the Marinas Towers. But you can see service elevators, central air conditioning, fully equipped laundry. It's somewhat more contained than your traditional apartment complex where you go to a laundromat off-site. These amenities are not built in. And also it's important that you own your condominium. You don't just rent it from somebody. And so this is at Ida and Jefferson. You can go see it this afternoon if you want to brave the rain. It's still there. All right, well, I will continue to give this presentation. Hopefully it will get better over time. If you think that, hey, this part of Des Plaines history would be great, give me a call or an email. I'll work it in for future audiences. If you want to be part of My Muse Des Plaines, I have the sign-up clipboard right here. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask me or stick around and look at the exhibit. Thank you very much.